name is Todd Maberry. I'm the Senior Director of Admissions, Recruitment, and Student Finance here at Duke Divinity School. Want to thank you for joining us. We're hoping to do a few of these over the next few weeks. Really blessed to have two of our ethics professors on this call, Dr. Patrick Smith and Dr. Luke Bretherton. Dr. Bretherton is the Cushman Professor of Moral and Political Theology. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Keenan Institute of Ethics. I think we're going to talk briefly about that later. Also have Dr. Patrick Smith, Associate Professor of Theological Ethics and Bioethics. Jump right into it. Dr. Smith, you were on here and ready to go. So I wonder if you could start off and tell us just a little bit about your scholarship and how did that scholarship land you at Duke?
Yeah, thanks so much, Todd, and welcome to all of those who are joining us this evening. It is a wonderful privilege and delight for us to share this space. And I do hope and pray that you and yours are as well as you can be during such uncertain and tumultuous times we find ourselves. But so Todd, thank you. And so my work is at the intersection of kind of moral philosophy, social ethics, and bioethics in many respects. And I started off interesting kind of route there, doing work in business administration as an undergraduate, but then started falling in love with the humanities. Thought about transitioning to that area, recognized I would be in school a little bit longer and decided to finish up in that route and went to do some theological studies and then some training in moral philosophy. So my work deals quite a bit with end-of-life ethics and the interface and intersection of bioethics and social ethics and how those come together. Also have the wonderful opportunity to teach a course on the ethical and political thought of Martin Luther King Jr., which is really interesting. And it's just been fun to work through those materials and think about the demand of that type of ethic and political thinking for our own contemporary context. And so I ended up at Duke. I moved in from the New England area just about 2.5 years ago. And it's just been a wonderful ride so far. I was doing some work in a medical school setting on one side, and then a theological seminary on the other side. And coming to a place like Duke Divinity School just enabled me to bring together those worlds in one place with a bit of synergy. And so just really excited to be here. I think there are some wonderful things that are happening at Duke Divinity School. I'm very excited about the future and the days ahead. And hopefully having the opportunity to work with me and the folks on this call.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Smith. And a few introductions I failed to make. A few of the mission staff are also on this call. Morgan Hendricks, Minoka Gunasekara, Ashley Cross. They're going to be doing some behind the scenes work. I also named two. We're going to have a hard stop at 9 o'clock. So we're going to be good with our time. Dr. Smith mentioned he has some family obligations. I promised my little girls I'd come up and kiss them before they fall asleep. So we're going to make good use of the time that we got here. Having said that, Dr. Bretherton, would you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your scholarship?
Absolutely delighted. Great pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, I do hope you're all staying well and faring well this kind of uncertain times. And so just a little bit about myself. As you can tell from my voice, I'm not from round these shores, so travel over from England. Came Londoner, born and bred, and moved over to join the faculty at Duke in 2012, having taught for many years at King's College London. I kind of fell into theological work. I worked for 6 or 7 years for a faith-based organization, actually after the Berlin Wall came down, and from about 1991 to the kind of mid 1990s. And was in that context working with churches that were engaging in a kind of post-communist landscape, from everything from rebuilding social welfare initiatives like orphanages through to people trying to do ethical business and doing some kind of theological education work, supporting what we now call knowledge transfer partnerships. And this was building links between groups in Central Eastern Europe and all the way up through Russia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, that kind of place, with work in the UK and the US. And a whole bunch of questions were raised for me in that context about how the church should engage a very diverse context. It was at the time when things like ethno-religious nationalism was on the rise. You had this kind of unfettered, turbocharged capitalism ripping through that context. Every religion was piling in and trying to missionize, and So I was trying to think, well, someone must have written about this theologically, and looking at churches struggling to cope. And so I kind of started doing some work, and people said, oh, you should do a PhD. So I kind of fell into doing a PhD with the intention of always going back into that kind of NGO type world, and then had the opportunity to teach and fell in love with teaching, and have kind of been doing that ever since. And so my work primarily addresses kind of moral and political questions and their intersection, and I try and think through how the church can faithfully engage socially, politically, economically. And that tends to play out. I teach courses on Christianity and capitalism, on Christianity and democracy. I've done a lot of work around community organizing and community development, and how the church, against what's often seen, is right on the kind of vanguard of forms of quite radical democratic activity, and kind of social transformation work, and looking at that and some of the difficulties of that. Some work around interfaith relations, not, are all religions the same, but more at a kind of practical level. How do different faiths, particularly in urban contexts, navigate and negotiate constructive relationships to address shared issues of concern, like a living wage, or a place for all the kids to play, or this kind of stuff. So I hope that gives you a little sense of the kind of background and some of the work I do, and the teaching that kind of bring to the Divinity School.
And Luke, I wonder if you could follow up with that. And given that both you and Patrick are at Duke, there's a few other colleagues. What would you say is distinctive about studying ethics at Duke? Maybe mention the Keenan Institute of Ethics that both you and Patrick are senior fellows at.
Yeah, I mean, in background, I would say one of the things that drew me to Duke, and I think there are very few places that do this in the world, and they're getting fewer, as it were. But I think the distinctive feature of Duke is it's a place where you can do kind of R1 or research excellent work. So we have world leading scholars in a university setting. So a lot of my work is interdisciplinary. So I want to be in conversation with leading experts, whether it's in cultural anthropology or political theory or political science or sociology, this kind of stuff. And so Duke is a context where theology is in dialogue with world scholars, but at the same time is passionate about the church and is passionate about Jesus Christ, and seeing the confessional dimensions of the work is absolutely central. And to that extent also seeing that the church isn't always the problem. Actually, the church is a vehicle for God's grace in the world. I think in some places the church is kind of pathologized and is always seen as the problem to be solved. I think one of the really lovely things about Duke Divinity School is that kind of world excellent scholarship that's in dialogue with other kinds of scholarship is put into dialogue with the church, and the kind of questions the church is wrestling with, whether that's around racism, whether that's around economic inequality, whether that's around how do you do church in a digital age or in the age of coronavirus, whatever it is, that the questions coming church and that everyone in the Divinity School is engaged in the church. That's that sense of a responsibility to do really excellent theological scholarship in the service of the church, and to generate wisdom that nourishes and kind of brings to life how we can be faithful, loving, hopeful witnesses in the contemporary context. So that's my sense of, I think, some of the kind of uniqueness. And then in terms of ethics, I think a particular area we are kind of driven by, it's not what are the problems in the sense in the tradition, although we're interested in that and curating the kind of great texts and the tradition to students, but what are the wounds in the world? Where are the places that the church or the world is hurting or suffering, where there's something existentially at stake for people? And that's driving the questions, that's driving how we're approaching it. And then turning to the tradition, turning to scripture, turning to other sources of knowledge to assemble ways of approaching that wound, but resting with the wound first and taking time to really sense of what's going on here. And I think that is, it's not kind of text talking to text. It's not oh, look, what did Augustine say? That I love reading all of that stuff, but I think a distinctive flavor of what we do at Duke, and it certainly characterizes Patrick and my work, is the question emerges out of a kind of wound in the world. And how do we think faithfully, hopefully, lovingly about resources to kind of to address that? But I'll hand over to Patrick and he can say a bit about that.
Yeah, in many ways, as my father, who was a pastor for several decades, would often say, after someone speaks and speaks very well on a particular topic, ditto, ditto, ditto. I do agree and would want to echo the same sentiments that Luke expressed. My work also has an interdisciplinary flavor to it, and a place like Duke that has so many different professional schools who are doing cutting edge research becomes just a very fertile ground for conversation and contribution. And even if one's positions don't always change, certainly our dispositions can be formed in particular kinds of ways that I think will be very important for just doing life together in many respects. One of the things I would just emphasize, as well, is this notion of the Divinity School's position in the broader university. There's something that is remarkable about the fact that the Divinity School can still speak into this larger world. And so my work in bioethics, oftentimes, people say rightly that the church needs bioethics. And I think it can also be rightly said that bioethics needs the church, as well as that voice, that those embodied practices that can bear witness, if I can use that phrase in a particular way. And another distinction I would say about studying ethics at a place like Divinity School is that many of the professors you will encounter, while we take our work, our academic work, very seriously. We're engaged in theoretical discussions, but I think many of us, if not all, have refused to hide behind the kind of academic lectern, so to speak, right? In some ways, as a friend of mine would often say, we try to have some skin in the game, or that we try to have boots on the ground in particular ways. I think bringing together a deep, robust kind of academic intellectual work with wrestling with questions, the lived embodied experience of human beings and reflection, and bringing all that to bear in the classroom, I think is a distinctive, and it's something that's awfully attractive to many of us. And it actually feeds the passion that we have for the work that we do. I think that carries over to the students, and we all are being formed together when you enter into these kinds of spaces. And so if you want to have a particular type of formation in human beings, that I think those who are in community together need to share those characteristics for that end.
Maybe Luke, could you give 60 seconds on the new certificate that you're helping launch, the faith-based organizing, advocacy, and social transformation?
Yes, so that's just a little bit of background on this. So we've got a couple of new certificates that are going. The one I've helped set up is certificate in faith-based organizing, advocacy, and social transformation. And this is really a vehicle for students who have a particular, either see as part of their congregational ministry, engaging in social transformation type work, social justice type work, or those who have a particular call to work in faith-based NGOs or non-governmental or not-for-profit organizations, or who are going to be engaged in providing kind of education or other social welfare type resources, and want to marry that commitment and that engagement with theological frameworks. And so the course, you have some core courses which help you kind of combine those two things. I teach a particular one on faith-based community organizing, and then there's some electives which give broader theological frameworks. And then you have to take a course outside of the Divinity School, either in the Sanford School of Policy or a parallel school, that kind of equip you in a particular area of policy. And then there's a funded field placement with relevant organization or church that's engaged in community development work or community organizing or some parallel activity. So the idea provides a way of students who have shared interest in that area to kind of find each other. but also to equip you with the kind of theological and practical resources and a kind of apprenticeship in how you do that, how you go about social transformation work. So yeah, that gives you a little bit. Just also 10 seconds on the Keenan Institute, which both Patrick and I are part of. That's just, the university is very committed to interdisciplinary work. It's a real strength of the university and welcomes that. And I will say that theology isn't just welcome, can be a key catalyst in different disciplines coming together to discuss different issues. And Keenan is just one of a number of institutes in the university which draw scholars together from all over the university. The particular focus of the Keenan Institute, and there's lots of links between the Divinity School and Keenan, is they call it a think and do tank. So it's trying to think through different moral and political issues, how that can actually engage in forms of kind of public scholarship that have a real social impact, and providing opportunities for students to be engaged in that. So yeah, that gives you a little bit of flavor of the Keenan Institute as well.
Excellent. Dr. Smith, maybe 60 seconds on theology, medicine, and culture and your involvement with that.
Yeah, the theology, medicine, culture is a kind of a program that we have at the Divinity School that tries to bring together healthcare professionals who want to engage in theological reflection, ask big questions about the nature of their vocation, given that the Christian tradition's relationship with questions of healing and medicine are so rich and so thick that it's a way of kind of supporting Christian healthcare professionals in their calling to heal the sick, which doesn't always mean that we will be providing cures, given the fact that a lot of healthcare training is very technical, and sometimes technocrats are generated more so than physicians and doctors. And so what this particular program does is just provide space for those individuals to come together to reflect on big questions about calling, and also to be formed theologically to shape what they think about medical practice. One quick distinctive that I deeply appreciate is the fact that we have several medical doctors who are key members of the Divinity School and who are also part of leading this particular program. And again, it just gives that kind of sense of realism and practicality to these initiatives as well. So I'll just maybe stop there. If there are other questions, maybe we can unpack it further if need be.
Excellent. We've got at least three of you that have said you have questions. Let's be ambitious and see if we can get to all three. Benji, I saw you were first. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, thanks for answering the question. Dr. Bretherton, I'm reading Resurrecting Democracy before I come. And so try that I have a book of ambitious books to get through. I've really enjoyed this. I really appreciated when you came and spoke at Baylor a couple of years ago when we met the first time. So I'm very excited to get to work with you again, hopefully on that certificate. But you were talking about, in the book, you talk about how accountability is critical for non-domination, particularly in the context of interfaith work. And obviously there's a sort of humility that you have to take with you into any sort of interfaith work. But how do you have accountability within frameworks and value frameworks and moral frameworks that at times can be at odds within a structure that doesn't seek to dominate, but that seeks to uplift the voices that are so often left oppressed?
Great question. Great to see you again, Micah. And wonderful you're reading the book. That makes me very excited. So yeah, I think this whole question, one of the key questions a lot of my work is born out of, was working with pastors and ministers. This was originally in the UK context, but it's a question I keep coming back to with clergy in the American context, is people want to bear faithful witness to Jesus Christ and be good neighbors to their Muslim or non-Christian or Sikh or whoever it is, or Jewish neighbors. And so how do we balance our strong commitment to our own belief practices and cherish them and honor them, while also being good neighbors to people who don't share those beliefs and practices? I think that's a central kind of problem that the church is trying to think through in the contemporary context. And I take it that kind of your question's pressing of that. And one of the things I've looked at is how particular kinds, not all Democratic does this. I certainly don't think party politics does this. I think party politics says everyone has to subordinate their approach to the demands of the party or the particular ideological framework of the party, whether that's from the left or the right. But I think particular kinds of democratic practices exemplified in something like community organizing, but not exclusively, I think there are many forms of this, becomes a point of mediation. There's a recognition that whether we like it or not, we all have a shared community of fate. If there's a virus, we all suffer. If the electricity goes out, we all suffer. If the hurricane comes through, we all suffer. So there are things which we share simply by living in the same place and have a common life. And then certain kinds of democratic practices allow for the negotiation of that, because fundamentally we're faced with three choices. When I encounter someone I disagree with and who fundamentally has a different vision of life to me, I can either kill them, and we see plenty of that around the world. I can either create a system to coerce them so I don't have to listen to them, or I can do some kind of politics. And so I think, and then what kind of politics is that? I look at kind of particular kinds of democratic politics which allow for relations of non-domination. Now, that does take certain kind of commitments. Certain kinds of religious groups or religious attitudes they do want to dominate, and so they're not going to engage. But I think there's surprisingly few. What isn't well known or well rehearsed is the kinds of practices which enable us to engage in. So what we tend to see is either people self-censoring, I don't want to speak Christianly because that would be offensive, or kind of over-asserting defensively because they're feeling they're being overly constrained. And neither of those two are very helpful. And so I think there are these particular kinds of democratic practices which allow for that mediation, where I can both bear witness to my own deeply cherished beliefs and practices and honor the fact that I share a common life with others who believe very different things to me. But we can have longer conversations about that when but hopefully that gets a little bit to your question.
Thanks for that, Dr. Bretherton. Dr. Smith, I wonder if you could answer Jonathan Sobel's question in the chat of defining the field of ethics independent of church relationships, and then how is that different or more relevant in a church context?
Wow, great question, Jonathan. And obviously full classes have been dedicated to answering that question and the related question as well. So I'll try to be brief and succinct here while recognizing that this could be expanded and nuanced in ways that maybe we don't have space to do it now. So when we think about this notion of ethics, the way I think about it is both being and doing, right? And so I had a colleague who he loved music, right? He says, well, I think about ethics like I think about music, doobie-doobie-doo, right? This notion of being and this notion of doing at the same time, right? That was his joke, right? Not mine, and I've just used it out here, right? So, right. But I do think in terms of character formation, the kinds of dispositions and virtues that we need to have become very, very important in what we do, how we do life together. I don't think ethics is merely about kind of quandaries, right? Or, dilemmas that have to be resolved. I think it's really thinking about how we do life together. And yes, there is a theoretical component. Our ethics or what we think is informed by what we think about the world. So we're all doing metaphysics in terms of how we come to know and understand the world, right? So there are questions of epistemology. There are traditions that inform and shape our ethical understanding, ethical life. I think all of those are important in terms of this larger idea of the field of ethics. And so this question about the relationship with the church, so much of what I think Dr. Bretherton or Luke just said a few minutes ago about the distinctives, yes, of a particular voice. Again, as I mentioned, we're all doing metaphysics. So there have been times where I have been giving talks in different spaces, and sometimes I'll use very explicit theological language. Other times I may not be as explicit theologically, but certainly what I'm saying is compatible theologically. And sometimes people would say, with a particular view that I hold, they'll ask you, well, how much is your, kind of theological, background kind of shaping, your view, or do you think that's influencing your view? And I would say, absolutely it is, in the same way that my friends who are philosophical naturalists views are informing their way of thinking about these issues, right? Because we're all doing metaphysics. And so this relationship in terms of the church, I do think there is a sense in which there is what I would call a communal ethic, an ethic in terms of Christian ethics that is much more particular and thick in a kind of way. And then I also think that Christians have a larger social ethic, or Dr. Bretherton would say a political theology, if I'm not mistaken here. And so some people look at social ethics as kind of the broader, sense outside the community. Others would say social ethics within the community, but we could just say political theology for this space. And so then that is the question of what are the resources of Christian tradition? If it informs the ethical life, what does it look like to live faithfully, but also with others who don't share our way of thinking about the world? So that's a nutshell with a lot that is left out with that particular question, but I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Dr. Smith. I think we have time for one more question. Max, if you want to ask your question, you can do it. We only got a few minutes though, so make it succinct.
Okay, hi. Thank you all for giving this talk. I just wanted to get kind of your immediate responses to the current crisis. There's a lot of intersection happening now with ethical concerns and economic resources. Specifically, Dr. Smith, what are your general feelings with how this is all going to play out in terms of the needs of particular people, particular populations, versus kind of the impact or the fallout on everybody? Yeah. And Dr. Bretherton too.
I think that this is a fundamental challenge. I think that when you look at the existing health disparities and healthcare disparities that we see amongst certain populations are stark. And then when you have something like a pandemic that hits, it even widens those kinds of disparities. And so my kind of short answer is just simply this, that any way forward, any policy that we're crafting, any plan going forward, I think we have to focus on the margins. We have to ask ourselves, what do these policies and these procedures, how might they exacerbate the situation of those individuals? Now, asking that question does not answer what we are supposed to do, but if we don't put that question front and center, often it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. And if it's left unsaid, too often it's left undone. And I also think that these kinds of situations that we are experiencing right now further exposes the kinds of inequalities that exist in our world, and that those inequalities are actually inequities because those inequalities are often a result of different types of injustices. So I do think this idea of loving our neighbor becomes very, very important in this time. And this is not about grandstanding or posturing in any way, but it's just about putting front and center the least of these as part of our ethical way forward.
Yeah, so Manoka's just put up in the chat section, there's a little short video of Patrick, myself, and our colleague, Brett McCarty, doing an initial discussion exactly around the kind of ethical dimensions of Christian responses to COVID-19. So I do commend that too. You can just kind of get it on the link there. Just to pick up on what Patrick was saying, because I think he's pressing a really, really important issue, which is how responses, particularly to the economic dimensions, will be framed. Will we see a further centralization and concentration of economic and political power, or will, in the responses, we see a distribution and an increase of capacity of ordinary people and localities to be able to respond and be resourced in their responses? So that side. At the kind of immediate level, I think there are big issues around how we understand the ethical dilemmas that everyone is facing. We see it acutely for medical staff, obviously with questions of triage and the allocation of things like ventilators and other scarce resources. having to make very difficult moral choices. But I think everyone from people stacking shelves in supermarkets to sanitation workers to folk working in utilities are having to make, again, very difficult choices around, do I stay at home, particularly if I've got someone in my household who is got pre-existing conditions, or do I go to work to kind of make life happen for everyone else? And what gets priority, the individual or private concerns or the greater need of public health? And in the triage situation, I think there's questions around how we understand the tragic and how we understand the kind of fraught and fragile nature of the human condition that the pandemic exposes. And we're heading into Holy Week, when we contemplate a story of death and suffering and in many ways difficult choices. And so I think there's great resources there within the Christian tradition to think about these situations and a long history of precisely responding to plagues and new institutions emerging. The birth of the hospital way back in the 4th century kind of emerges in many ways out of a response to plague when Christians stayed in the city when everyone else fled. And so I think there's a real imaginative and theological challenge for the church, even as the church itself is struggling with things like tithing and how do you keep church going in a sense of community. But I think the kind of need for that imaginative institution building in response, and then how we think about mutual aid as a response, as against either market and state-based solutions, I think is a key to going forward. But yeah, I do commend that little discussion, and both Patrick and I are writing stuff that can be shared with you, trying to think theologically and resource the church to address this with words of life at a time when there's so much death.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, we're just a few minutes past time. I can see Dr. Smith and Dr. Brother are still on. Any parting words or well wishes?
Luke, you want to begin?
I do want to say, I think there's been a big change in faculty at Duke, and I'm really excited by the folk. And it's just this, everyone, I think if you come, everyone there has this deep commitment to nourishing the life of faith in the contemporary context, and not shying away from the difficult questions, even though we might disagree with each other. And I think that is a kind of one of the things I find hope is just the quality and character of the folk who are there, and the seriousness with which they take the task, and the kind of intellectual work. It isn't everything, but it is something, and it makes an important contribution in amongst all the other contributions of the field work and spiritual formation and everything else. And I think that's particularly at a time like this, we are, unless we can bring to bear rich theological resources to frame these kinds of problems and help people make sense of where is God in this, we're not able to actually feed and nourish the sheep, which is Christ's commission to us as pastors and ministers. So I think that is a real gift that I know my colleagues want to share, and it's something we're all deeply passionate about in this work. Patrick, you have a final word for us.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. We are extremely grateful and excited that you're considering coming here to do Divinity School. We are convinced and persuaded that you will be formed in a way that you can bear witness for your particular calling that God has given to you. And so I do encourage you to be safe and be as well as you can during this very difficult time. And this is a reminder for us, not only the solidarity that brings all of us together, but it's also for those of us who lean into Christian tradition, is a reminder that God is not dead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. This was a real treat to be able to talk with you virtually. To everybody else, I just want to say pay attention. We've got some great conversations coming with Sujin Pak, Edgardo Colon and Marique, David Goatley, Jerusha Neal, Norma Wurtzba, Jeremy Begbie. We're planning those all over the next couple of weeks, so pay attention to your email. It'll be a format kind of like this. I thought this worked really well. So appreciate you all breaking us in and taking time out of your evening to join us. If it's I'd love to close this in a word of prayer, if that's all right. I'm
Please do.
Ordained minister. That's what I do. All right. God, I pray that you would form us into the type of people who know how to do and how to be your love in this world. In the name of your son, Jesus, who taught us the way. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much, Todd.
Thanks, y'all.